Remember to click like, subscribe, the bell notification, and whatever else YouTube has you clicking on to support us.
Hello, hello, hello. This is Cruellica Kain here, and today I'm going to be doing my own version of Let's Talk compared to what Kaiji Okami has typically done for his prior videos. So it's just going to be me and only me today. And this is going to be a heavy topic, so I will preface this for anyone who doesn't pay attention to whatever title Kaiju shares, that this is going to be a video on a heavy topic of addiction and recovery. I am specifically doing this because I know I've slightly mentioned in other videos about my torrid past, but I actually wanted to do this video in honor today of my late uncle's birthday. He would have been 71 today. I know I'm recording this on April 1st, but you may watch it another day in the week or even later in the future. And the point of doing this is to talk a little bit about my experiences growing up with my uncle, my own experiences as an addict, as well as possibly giving anybody who's watching some tips to help themselves, family, friends that may be addicts and may not know it or anything like that. So I'm going to start with just a very basic thing for anyone who is unfamiliar with what an addiction is. So even when I was a teenager back in the 90s, addiction was always this dirty word that you didn't talk about publicly. It was something that you hid because your addicts in your family are usually the people that you don't want to show to the public. And the definition of addiction, and I always like this from the Oxford Dictionary because it's true: the fact or condition of being addicted to a particular substance, activity, or thing. And most people think that when you're an addict, you're either addicted to alcohol or you're addicted to drugs. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this video is essentially addictions to both of those items. But there's other types of addictions out there that I feel that people should become more comfortable talking about it and talking about how to support those that are going through addiction and how to know that there's different types of coping mechanisms and resources out there. And I'm actually going to talk about a lot of the untraditional resources that people might use to help recover from addiction versus going into a clinic or anything like that. And so just a little bit about my family. I'm first going to go with my real name. As many probably already know, my name is Kelly. And my uncle, who I'm going to be honoring today, his name was John Patrick Sisson. And he actually died in December of last year of 2024. And it was kind of all of a sudden because he was 70 years old, and outside of his addictions, he was never in failing health. However, in the last few years, his addictions took a very negative impact on his life, more so than before. And while it wasn't drugs that technically killed him, they did help play a big part. And so in honor of him and all the work I've done in my life, I wanted to talk about it and make sure that others can be helped and know that it's not the worst thing in the world to admit that you're an addict. So my uncle and many of my other family members have been addicts for a long period of time. My uncle, my grandfather, my great-grandmother, and even my own mother were addicted. And my aunt is addicted. to something that's not drug related. So you're very used to seeing this pattern. Now, addiction, just for anyone who doesn't know a lot about it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing if you have not experienced it or had a family member, but addiction can come in two forms. It can come from more of a hereditary manifestation, or it can come from just the influence of the environment that you're around. For my mother, my uncle, my aunt, and my grandfather and great-grandmother, it was very much so hereditary. My great-grandmother, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, had a lot of addictions to narcotics to help her cope. And this was to allow her to cope with her mental health. She had significant issues with mental health, being bipolar and depression and anxiety. And back in that time of the late 1800s, early 1900s, even into the 1920s and 30s, because this was an ongoing thing for her throughout my grandfather's life, she would go into asylums. And if you've seen any kind of horror movie or any kind of movie talking about asylums back in the day, a lot of times they're not the most helpful thing, because most people who have mental health issues tend to be thrown into an asylum, looked at as that they have problems, that they can't cope with the world, that they're othered. Much similar to what some people deal with today in mental health, in LGBTQ plus communities, especially those that are transitioning in their lives to be the right body type that they've always visualized themselves. So addiction came for her in the matter of narcotics, specifically more, I'm not going to go into specifics on the drug types, but more of the narcotics that would help her cope and stay active and up. So most people colloquially call them uppers, and she drank a lot. My grandfather, going through the stress of that, as well as being a World War II veteran, when he came back home after the war, he drank a lot to cope with dealing with his ailing mother, who was later in her life at that point, as well as recovering from very traumatic experiences that he dealt with in the war. He even had to go into an asylum for a little bit to get what's called shock therapy, because they thought they could cure addiction in the late 40s, early 50s by electrocuting people. And I think about that today, of putting somebody in a situation where you're electrocuted to become normal. And it deterred my grandfather from drinking for many, many, many decades after that. So you could say it worked, but not the way I think asylums at that point in time, or doctor's offices at that point in time, thought they would work. Because most people today can go to therapy or take certain types of antidepressants or medications that can help them with their anxiety, their mental health, their PTSD, and the like. So that was hard. My uncle, I'm going to first go with my uncle before I talked about my aunt who's older. My Uncle John, he also had his own mental health issues himself, because my uncle had learning disabilities. He wasn't necessarily autistic like what we look at it today. I don't think they really tested for that for my uncle, but he had a very pronounced stutter, which I actually have when I'm incredibly nervous or unsure what to say. I stutter myself, but he had a very pronounced stutter at times. And he also didn't learn as quick as others. So he was a very intelligent man, but it took him longer to grasp a concept and learn compared to others. And while he wasn't necessarily bullied, to cope with being treated differently, because even in the 80s and early 90s, anyone with a learning disability, depending on the severity of it, was separated from the rest of the group. So how he coped is he got into drugs, and he got into what you can probably call for many people as the bad crowd. People that were also feeling othered or didn't know how to cope sometimes, that they got into drinking and drugs. And where some people may grow out of it, and addiction is not necessarily always a permanent thing. You can be an addict for a very short period of time. That's why some people will say, I'm addicted to Toku, or I'm addicted to anime. It's not that true definition of addiction, and I don't take any sense of anger when somebody talks about it flippantly of addiction, because I know they don't mean mean-spirited, and it's because they really like something so much. But where others may have grown out of their addiction, my uncle, he stayed with it. And then my mom, being that she was 5 years younger than my uncle, she was very distant from her other older two siblings because they were 9 and 10 years older than her. And by the time my mom was born, my grandparents were much older. They were in their mid to late 30s. So trying to run after a child that had a lot of health issues when she was born. My mom was born 2 months early. She was very, very tiny. And in the late 50s, there was a lot of fear of her not surviving. So my mom, she was closest to my Uncle John. And so when he got into drugs, when she was a little bit older in her teenage years, she did the same thing as well. She would talk about stories about how they would come home high off their heads, and my grandparents my grandparents being very old-fashioned and very conservative, they didn't know how to handle that, so they did what anyone did in the 60s and 70s. They just ignored it, because as long as they weren't hurting anyone else or stealing from them, there was nothing wrong. And that was not necessarily the greatest decision to make. I will say, looking back at it as an adult, I would say that was probably very neglectful of them. And I wouldn't call my grandparents neglectful, because they were, for on and off many years of my life, just like my Uncle John, my rock. At some future date, I might do a Let's Talk on child abuse. If anybody would like to not hear about my sad story, but how I've coped with child abuse and how I've grown from it as an individual. But with the addiction, my uncle, there were many times he tried to get clean and it didn't work. Some of the times he tried to get clean was right around when I was born, because my mom, I'll just put it bluntly, I learned my birth father's name when I was in my mid-20s, when I had to get a new Social Security card, because at that time when I was born, you had to put his name on some kind of Social Security form for that, but he's not listed on my birth certificate. Like, I legitimately on my birth certificate do not have a name listed for my father. And my mother's name is Mary, so you can jokingly say it's Immaculate Conception. But my birth father, he basically cheated on his wife with my mom. And when my mom got clean halfway through her pregnancy with me, The only thing she did was smoke and drink soda. I know what other people can say if they're watching the video. Smoking is not necessarily the smartest thing to do when you're pregnant, but this was in 1980. Not many people knew what to consciously do in 1980, and my mother was she was barely 21 when I was born, so she was still a child. And I can say that because I was pregnant at 19, so I understand when I say that now in my 40s. So she had me, and for a little while, I actually lived with my mom and my uncle, because my uncle, being the forever bachelor and being closest in age to my mom, even though there was a 5-year difference, my Uncle John was essentially like the first dad I had for the very early part of my life until I was probably about 3 or 4, when my mother got married to my first stepfather. And he would continue to be that rock. Like, he still did drugs, he still did terrible things to his own body, but the one thing he learned by having a niece that was around was that he had somebody to care about and to focus on to help reduce that need for that addiction sometimes. It wasn't a perfect manifestation, but there were times where it really helped. My mom, she's still with us. She was an interesting sort of addict. I say that because she's not really an addict anymore, mainly because she has adjusted her addictions to other things, such as being connected to my stepdad. And I love my stepdad. And I learned this because when she wasn't going through addiction heavily, she was addicted to that caring for another human being. And there were times where that helped her as I was a kid. My mother, though, had a hard time with drugs when I was growing up. As I said, I'm not going to talk about specific narcotics, and I highly doubt this video is going to get monetized, so I love you, my husband. But there were many times where my uncle would have to be that adult for my mom and actually take her out of the addiction, because her and my stepfather were in it. And when I say in it, there were times where they would use my baby carriage as a way to smuggle bad things across the Canadian border into the US. And once again, probably not the smartest thing to have with a child. Looking at it as an adult, for a very much younger, immature adult, very different. But with my uncle, there were many times where he raised me just like my grandmother and grandfather. More times where I needed it compared to what I feel my mom or my first stepdad did. My first stepdad, his name is Marty. His name was Marty. He passed away a very long time ago, and that was where my addiction came from. My mother utilized addiction a lot to cope with not seeing the abuse or not seeing what she went through or what I went through as a kid. So there were many times I ran away to my uncle. And yes, he had his own addiction, but the one thing that he was able to do better than my mom at times is he was able to compartmentalize. And the addiction, was hard for him. I know it was hard for him, but he never let it affect his ability to care for his family. He never let it affect his ability to work. He was a section manager for many years, so he had a very functioning life. And there were times where he was almost clean. And I think what kept him clean for a lot of on and off throughout my childhood, when he stayed that way, was me. Because my grandparents couldn't get him clean. My mom couldn't get him clean. But seeing the hell I went through, there were many times my Uncle John got himself temporarily clean to help me, either to have a safe place where I can talk and vent, to have a safe place where I can hide and not have to go home, or where I could walk away. Now, once I got a little bit older into my teenage years, I still connected with my uncle a lot, but around the age of 12 is when I started smoking, and it wasn't until I was 14, 15 that I started doing other stuff. And the one thing I learned from my uncle, which was probably not the best thing to learn, because that's the thing he taught me unknowingly that my mother never could, is I learned how to function very, very well no matter what was going on around me. I could do tons of drugs and still wake up, be a normal human being, function, and no one would be the wiser. And I know my uncle, wherever he is, would probably be sad to hear that, to know that one of the best skills he taught me was how to compartmentalize and have my addictions, but nobody be any wiser. My uncle wasn't aware of my addictions, of what I was doing to myself, until I was probably about 16, 17. And that was one of the few times in my life I think my uncle was highly disappointed in me, because I was close to graduating high school and he just did not want to see me go down the path that I did. And I never did any of the narcotics or bad things that my uncle or my mom did to the degree that they did. I did go down some pretty dark paths, but it was hard to stay away from it. And it was scary because I could do it as well as he could. And there was a part of me that was proud of myself for the fact that I could hide it so well. And I think what also disappointed him heavily is the way I got all of the drugs I got was from my mother and my stepfather. Now, my stepfather was the bigger issue. Marty had no qualms against it. My mom initially was against it, and then Marty basically overrode her and allowed me to take the drugs. And I started doing that, like I said, around 14. And I think the reason why is because Marty knew I would have done it anyways, because I needed something to help me cope with ensuring that my mother was alive. That because my mother could not cope And she could not survive any of the beatings I took. So that's why I got into addiction. I was outside of smoking for the first 2 years. Yes, I smoked a lot up until I stopped fully smoking at any point in time in 2008. I could smoke up to a pack a day. And I was raised around smokers. So even my uncle smoked. And once I was older and could legitimately make decisions for myself, he did not care about me smoking around him, but not when I was a teenager. But my Uncle John, he went down a path where he felt that he needed to have normalcy of what he saw my mom get with her second marriage to my current stepdad, who is a dad to me. I respect him and love him, even if we don't agree politically. But once he saw my mom recover and find a new love after ejecting Marty, and around the time that my grandmother passed away, I think he felt that he needed to have someone in his life because he knew I was growing up, I was in college, and he didn't want to be alone. So he met a woman who initially was a lovely person. The problem was she was much more addicted than he was to a lot of different narcotics, to the point where in the early 2000s, probably around 2003, 2004, he did this backward slide because my grandmother passed away, my grandfather was coping, and by getting back into his addiction of drinking, and I had to step in a little bit more and help my grandfather cope along with my mom, because at this point in time my mom was not doing any narcotics anymore because she had met my stepdad Alan, who helped her kick everything, and that I was much grateful for, because even though I was stuck a little bit, she finally got the help she needed after so many years. At this time, I was starting to date Kaiju, Marcus, and he's the one by 2002 helped me kick a lot of my bad habits, including alcohol, drugs, and the like. I didn't fully kick everything out of me until probably about 2003, 2004. But I will say Marcus helped a lot of getting me out of my addiction. Once I got to that point of not being addicted anymore and my grandfather was getting the care and help he needed, I wanted to turn my attention to my uncle, because my uncle John was the rock in my life, and I wanted to take the time to live with him fully and help care for him, and even though he was married, help kick those drug addictions like Marcus was helping me and Alan was helping my mom. Well, apparently I learned that I took negatively for many, many years, and it breaks my heart that I did. In 2004, when I was ready to live with my uncle, his now ex-wife, well, even if he passed, so she'd be late wife anyways, she did not like me. Her son did not like me, to the point where I started bringing things over to my uncle's house, and she and her son stole everything of mine. And when I confronted them about it, my uncle defended her rather than supporting me. And I understand to a degree, this was his wife. He wanted to build this relationship, build this family, that he felt that I was already in my early 20s. And I think this was his way of trying to push me away and get me to go on my own. That he wanted me to leave, but I took his decision to defend his wife very negatively. And at that time, till many years later, it really fractured our relationship to the point where I didn't talk to him for a number of years, because selfishly, he was that consistent dad for me. And I know my mom wouldn't understand that, because she'd say, well, Marty was in the picture. But he was that role model, because even if my Uncle John, with his addictions, had his problems, he was so much of a safer place than Marty. Because I didn't have to worry about what type of abuse physically or mentally that I would be taking to protect my mother, who at that time did not seem to care. And if Mom, you do end up watching this, I'm sorry, but I need to get this shared out for the world. Throughout the years since Marcus and I moved to Colorado, I have had different types of addictions, mainly dealing with alcohol, or silly it will seem, shopping addictions since then. But the one thing I will say for anyone who has a family member who's an addict, recovering or not, or knows of someone who may have a family member or is an addict themselves, the one thing that has helped a lot is by having someone there for you. My uncle was that for many years, as that familial aspect, because he and I were very in sync on being able to function as people even with our addictions. However, around that time, it got harder and harder with my grandmother just passing away, that it really took Marcus to help me see the value of myself as a person. While I can have my uncle and my mom and my stepdad Alan and my grandparents prior to my grandmother passing away, and then my grandfather passing away years later, they can tell me as family, because most people feel that inclination of your family loves you, so they're going to tell you what you want to hear. It wasn't until Marcus really told me about me and how much he cares and everything like that, and his love for me, that really helped me get kicked out of it. So the biggest takeaway I would say is, if you are an addict or ever fear that you are, don't be afraid to take that hand of help. Having someone put a helping hand out there, even if sometimes they're sarcastic with it, don't be afraid to take it. And even if you, like myself, push back and say, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, the one thing that Marcus could see that none of my family members could see, or even many of my friends that I knew for decades could see, is that I wasn't fine. And he was able to call me on my bullshit and be that voice for me. So first and foremost, if you are an addict, don't slap away the help. That may come from a loved one or a friend. The next thing is, if you are a family member or a friend or know someone, don't give up on them. Sometimes they need that heavy adult in the room type thing of telling them what to do. For my mother, even though I was still in my own addiction, for my mother, I literally poured all of her drugs in the toilet and flushed it multiple times because it filled up the toilet, to help her get away from it. And because mine was very different than hers, there was not much she could do for me. Because she really didn't understand it, because I could cope better than she could. I will say, give that helping hand, be that support, and don't look down upon somebody for their addictions. They are just as much of a person as you are. And those addictions don't make them any less, any more worthless, any stupider or foolish. Yes, they are doing damage to their own bodies, which is stupid and foolish. You need to know that there is just a mechanism in their brain, either in that hereditary aspect where you have so many family members who end up doing it and you have that predilection to already being an addict even without trying, or there's just something that's a little clicked off in their brain that they don't know what they're doing is wrong for themselves. And that's always the hardest part. And that was always the hardest part for me. I never thought about how much money I was spending or how many bad things I was doing, because one, I never stole from anyone. So anything I spent on my addictions came out from my own wallet. I was never forcing anyone else to do the things I did. I either surrounded myself with the people who were already doing it, or did it in a place or a way that it wouldn't affect anyone else. And sometimes that succeeded, sometimes that didn't. But I always tried to make sure that no matter what, I was the most responsible person in their perspective, even if I was doing so many terrible things behind the scenes. The reason why I still call myself an addict, like my uncle always did, even when he started to get clean later in his life, is that there's always this trigger that for someone who's in recovery, that they may say or look or be like, what I wouldn't give to do something like that. Well, it's not like I'm hurting anyone. I'm much more responsible now. You'll hear a lot of those types of excuses, so to speak, when somebody goes back to it. And there's been many a times that I've gone back to it, to the point where, with the help of Kaiju, Marcus, sorry, so used to channel name, with the help of Marcus, I've had to remove everything from my life that was that addiction. Like, unless it's for cooking, I don't keep any alcohol in the home. I don't have any cigarettes near me. Anytime, even medical marijuana, I don't allow that, and he doesn't either, to come in my sphere. Because as much as they want to say that there is no such thing as a gateway drug, I am a perfect example that it truly is. Because there's so much more you can do when you have let down your reserves on anything else. Not that it is that way for everyone, but it is for me. So I work really hard to take all of those away from me. Now, bringing it back to the type of channel that Marcus has created, this, starting with Kaiju no Kami and then going to Toku and Animation News Network, I will honestly say one of the things that helped me early on in our relationship, because I was the junkie anime fan, my dear husband was the clean cut, tried and true, nothing wrong with it, perfect example of a nerd. There was nothing that really was perfectly in sync for us. Like, we had certain things in common, like anime, interests in music, and things like that. But beyond that, I could give two shits about Power Rangers at that time. And still certain times when I watch some Power Rangers, I'm like, oh my God, this came out when I was a kid. Seriously. But we didn't have the maximum number of things in common. We were very different people. I still today, my goal was always to grow in that corporate ladder, because I like the power and influence that comes from it, which in its own way is kind of an addiction, where Marcus is significantly more creative and free-spirited and likes to manage his own world, versus me. I can't work with them. I can't work with somebody hovering over my head, but I like that creating a process and leading teams and improving the quality of whatever it may be. So we were very different in that path. But one thing that really brought us together, even though he started it before I did, was truthfully tokusatsu. Because I never knew much about it. Earlier in our relationship, he knew some about it because he was starting to learn more and more about it, because the internet was bigger at that time. Nothing like it is today, but much bigger than what we had well before that in the late 90s. And so we started watching shows like Ryuki and oh God, I can't remember the first Sentai we watched, but we watched shows like that. And what really helped me, and this is why I'm a bigger Kamen Rider fan than I am Super Sentai at times, is because those stories could help me relate to certain things to come back from. So the reason why Ren Akiyama is my favorite character, outside of the fact that the actor is incredibly attractive, is that he was dealing with a lot of tragic issues and had a lot of mental health issues due to it. And this addiction of being number one and being the most powerful really drew me to him, as well as the story as a whole for Ryuki. And then when you get to other stories like Faiz and Blade and so many other Kamen Rider shows, it was fascinating. That's why I personally have to say, as someone who has battled addiction for, oh my God, 33 years, I can honestly say that's why I really enjoy the premise of GOV, because you really see so many people dealing with addiction, of the dark confections and everything like that. So tokusatsu, honestly, I will say, helped save me, because yes, I have still to this day a loving husband who supports me, helps me, is my rock in so many different ways that I think people don't know or don't understand. Tokusatsu was a different type of storytelling that I had never seen in America. I love horror. I love comedy. I have all of that. But sometimes it always felt like when you had stories talking about addiction or mental health or anything like that, they were picking on it, that they weren't taking the thought process seriously. And so when I found Kamen Rider through my loving husband, it was a whole new world for me to be able to watch stories, especially because I was in the age range that these characters were as well, that I was able to connect with it and not feel so isolated. That's why I like so many different series of Nana and anime. And, well, I meant to say anime, but specifically Nana, because that's kind of the story that they're telling there. And seeing so much that's out there helped me a lot. And having non-traditional things, such as anime or music or anything that can help me feel like there's a story being told that I can hear, that is not trying to stuff it down my throat, has helped a lot. I have tried therapy. I have tried clinics. And I can say for me specifically, none of that has worked for me. Always because I always feel judged. And that's a challenge with my personal mental health issues and how I dealt with how I handled my addictions, because I could handle it in such a way that I never felt like I was being judged. And when I go to ask for help myself personally in those formats, I always feel like they're judging me. Even if that is certainly not the case, there are times where I feel like that, and it's hard for me to entrust someone to tell them about my FUBAR childhood and make it where I can cope for it. Because one of the reasons why I did the things I did, unlike my uncle and unlike my mom, who both came in middle class upbringings, that, not to discount any of the issues that they had to deal with in the 60s and 70s, but they came up in a well-to-do household. Yes, my grandmother had a lot of health issues, but and my uncle was still very well-to-do until the last few years of his life, but I was raised predominantly in a very poor home. There were many times I didn't have working electricity or working heat in the middle of Buffalo, and learned how to use propane appropriately in a home that could go up like a match. And so I learned how to not have things, how to acquire things however needed to, or anything like that. And when the addiction bug hit me when I was 12, I utilized all of that to help me cope with the fact that I had a horrible childhood, that I had a horrible life, that yes, there were good times. There's no such thing as somebody living in a horrible life with no good times. But watching my peers in school have things that I didn't have, or I couldn't have without stealing it, was very hard. And so there was no way for me to get out of the first phase of my addiction until probably about 2002, 2003. And then closer to probably about 2008, for about 5 years, I became a functioning alcoholic at anime conventions. And we went to a few, and I learned very quickly that I still had a taste for the addiction. So I would drink and find reasons to drink and drink the entire time. Like, there were many times at many of the conventions I went to, I was not sober for more than a quarter of it. And I have, because of my addictions, especially starting so young, I had for many years a high ability to take in a lot before it truly affected me, to the point now I have an incredibly crazy pain tolerance. But when I am in pain, I can't take the normal things, just like my uncle couldn't, just like my mom couldn't. I can't take 2 Tylenol all the time or 2 ibuprofen to get rid of the pain. I have to take more because my body needs more. A lot of my mental health issues, a lot of my physical issues, like I have fatty liver disease, all of that is because of the shit things I did. And in honor of my uncle, I do want to remind people, as he always told me when he did find out about my addictions, is you aren't alone. Not that you're alone as an addict. There are other addicts with you. There is that. But you're not alone. Don't be afraid to talk about addictions. And addictions are not just drugs or alcohol. Getting back to, as I mentioned earlier on in the topic, my aunt. My aunt was addicted to God. She is a Sister of Mercy. Those are very, very devout nuns. And she wasn't always a nun. She was married for a number of years, got divorced, had to go through the process of basically becoming a virgin again in the sense of Catholicism. So her marriage was written off, and my cousins were kind of written out. She still has a relationship with them, but she's very devout. She gave up all of her prior life for God. And I say it was an addiction because, unlike many other people that I've met who are Roman Catholic, or even priests or nuns or anyone in that community, she was incredibly addicted to God, to the point where she would judge you for everything you did. And it affected a lot of the relationships in our family, because while my family is very Roman Catholic, nobody was as devout as she was, and it was always a thing. So know that there are addictions to it. Most people know of gambling. Gambling addiction is something I fear every time, because I have that predisposition that if I like something enough, I can become very addicted to it. That's why I don't play a lot of those online games that you can pay to proceed. Anytime I get into seeing those games, I quickly delete them, because if I have a predisposition for addiction, I can become an addict of anything. So that's very hard. And thankfully, knocking on wood, none of my family members were ever addicted to gambling, because that is a cruel, cruel mistress. There's addiction to video games. I know people are probably seeing ads online now about, are your kids addicted to video games? There are true addictions to it. There are addictions to food. There's addictions to sugar. And so just because they're not your traditional, that's why I say, don't be ashamed if you do have some sort of addiction. There are today many other ways to help yourself and to not feel isolated. There's a lot of communities out there. It's amazing. Even on Reddit, which sometimes can be toxic, there's a lot of communities to talk about things, and you can do it anonymously where you don't have to feel judged. And I recommend it for anyone who is worried about it. But please know, even though I meandered, which is a challenge of mine when talking about heavy topics like this, don't judge anyone for their addictions, current or former. Know that if they are in recovery, that they have worked incredibly hard to overcome something that many people unalive themselves for multiple times. And I can be a testament to the fact that my high school graduation, I tried to unalive myself through my addiction. So be proud of them if they've overcome an addiction or if they've relapsed. Be proud of them for what they've worked on and offer them the support they need to get over that hurdle again. Because it can be very easy to relapse and it can be incredibly scary. I've relapsed 2 to 3 times in the last 20 years. And don't ignore somebody if they're a fellow fan of whatever you like and they are profusely demonstrating they have an addiction. Don't turn your back on them. Obviously, do what's in your comfort level to support them, like become a friend or just say, hey, you like what I like. Try to help distract them from that addiction, talking about something fun. That's what happened with me for tokusatsu and helped me kind of get over that hurdle time and time again. And if you are someone going through addiction, don't just find coping mechanisms. Find ways that you can utilize it to springboard you to being able to walk away. I will admit I got through all of my current addictions throughout my recovery process cold turkey because I am power hungry and so I am control freak. So I use that to force myself to do cold turkey, and let's just say it sucks. Cold turkey is not for everyone. It doesn't work. Sometimes you do need to go into a facility for any type of addiction, no matter what it is, or even if you have any issues mental health wise. I, just like my great grandmother, I am bipolar. I have severe depression and anxiety. Plus, I'm an extrovert with social anxiety, which is a fun combination. Rare, but fun. So I am definitely on that neurodiverse level, and it's very hard. And I know there are many times I feel for Marcus having to support a partner that has to go through this. And the reason why I'm talking about it today and the reason I have fought to stay clean time and time again, even if I've relapsed, is because I remember the look of disappointment on my uncle's face when he found out I had started going down the same path that he and my mom did. And while I worked very hard to cope and control it, there were times it got the better of me. And there were times where I was able to control it. And once I was able to fully first get into that recovery in the early 2000s, I was proud of myself. And I know at that time, before the falling out between my uncle and I, he was proud of me because I was able to accomplish something at that time he fully could not commit to. Because while he did his short stints of recovery, he relapsed very easily and very quickly. And I know there was pride, and I know for many, many years, even if we didn't talk, I know he was proud of me, even if he never said it, for all the times in all the years that I stayed clean. And so going forward, the one thing I hope to do is continue to stay on that path and continue to be unafraid and unashamed of who I was, of the addictions I had. And there was one I didn't purposely talk about in this video because it's already going to be demonetized. You don't need to know about everything in my life because then you're going to wonder why Kaiju's with me. But there are many things that I've worked hard to overcome, and I stay that way. I know my mom has relapsed a few times. She's still staying strong with what she's able to do. But at the end of it all, I do want to say I'm proud of myself of where I've come. I know my uncle, still to this day, is proud of me as well. I am thankful beyond a shadow of a doubt that my uncle is out of pain, that he doesn't have to worry about relapsing ever again. And my wish for anyone who knows of somebody who's an addict or is a recovering or an addict themselves that might watch, that there is another side to it. And in the addiction, sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you don't see everything around you. And you don't know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And sometimes it just takes listening to someone or being willing to tell yourself it's enough. Whatever I was doing this for, I've let it go on too long. And don't turn a blind eye at the help. And don't be ashamed of yourself. If you have to go in for someplace and they may judge you, I know that's my biggest fear. Acknowledge it and ignore it, or no, in reality they're not. I know that was hard for me, but don't let it control you or someone you love. And last thought, don't be ashamed of having a family member if they are an addict, because there was probably a reason why they became that. And the most important thing is you want to talk to them about it. Find out within reason what could have taken them down that dark path, and see if there's a way that you can help them, or just be that cheerleader supporting them for every little milestone and accomplishment they make. I myself have been fully in recovery and clean of anything for the last nearly 7 years now, and even though I've relapsed a few times prior to that, I haven't yet, and I'm really proud of the achievements I've made. And even though I frustrate Marcus with all of the health issues I've had because of my addictions, I know that I'm doing better and I'm getting the help I need to make sure that I can still live a long, long life no matter what I've done to myself. So I don't know how long this Let's Talk's been. Hopefully I haven't bored anybody with my talk. Hopefully it's helpful. Hopefully you've seen another side to it. And if you've never known anyone who's an addict or never been around somebody who's an addict, that's a good thing as well. While addicts don't have anything to be ashamed of, it is good when you know that you're in a safe environment and you can be comfortable with yourself and not fear about having to find a way to cope with it. So that is great. And hopefully this video can just tell you a little bit more about addicts, so that if you do get in a situation where you see one, you know how to manage it. And at the end of it all, be safe, take care of yourselves. And unlike myself, my mom, my uncle, my grandfather, my great-grandmother, be okay with being different. Don't be afraid to raise your hand if there's something bad going on in your life. Never let yourself get bullied. And if you're in a dangerous situation, find a way out of it. Those are the biggest things I will say, because those are the things that none of my family, including myself, ever did until sometimes it was too late. And my uncle, he's in a better place, and my Uncle John is an incredible person, had a great personality, was misunderstood significantly, but I still love him very much. And that's it for my Let's Talk. And have a wonderful rest of your day, month, year, wherever you see this. And I'll see you on another video with Kaiju. Bye!